Hi, I'm Dave Sleet, and this is a Sleet Report. Oh, Samson. Samson, Samson, Samson. So special and yet so flawed, like birthday party without any cake. So special because God had chosen him to rescue his people. So special because God had chosen him before he was born and set him apart as someone who would be different. So special because God gave him superhuman strength. But he had so many flaws. He did exactly what he wanted. He was violent, he was selfish, he broke all the rules God had given him to make him different. He didn't listen to his parents, he ignored God. He was like a spoiled, selfish child. Not exactly who I'd pick to be God's rescuer, but God picked him. One thing you could say for him is that he was a very good representative for the Israelites. Not that he was the best of them, but that they were all as bad as he was. In some ways, he was your typical Israelite, because the Israelites were special but flawed as well. Special because God had chosen them to be his people, and special because God had set them apart as people who should be different to everyone around them. They were supposed to show the world what it was like to be God's people, to show the world what God was like. But they were rubbish at it. They broke all the rules God had given them to make them different. They did exactly what they wanted to do. They forgot all about God. In fact, by now, the Israelites were so bad that even though they had been ruled over by the Philistines for 40 years, a really long time, they hadn't even thought about asking God for help. Remember this old pattern that keeps happening again and again? God's people turn their back on God. God punishes his people. God's people cry out to God. God rescues his people. Well, they'd completely missed a step. No crying out to God here. Oh no, you wouldn't catch the Israelites doing that. They didn't even think about God. They almost didn't seem to mind doing whatever the Philistines told them and being bullied by them and becoming just like them. It's like they'd forgotten they were supposed to be God's special people at all. Now, it's a good thing that God wasn't as forgetful as them, isn't it? They were his people, and he wasn't going to let them go. He was going to rescue them from the Philistines, and he didn't even wait for them to ask him to do it. You see, the thing is, the Israelites weren't special because they were better than everyone else. They were special because God had chosen them. And God hadn't chosen them because they were good and perfect and great at spelling or anything like that. He had chosen them because they were the people he wanted to choose. The Israelites being God's special people said more about God than it said about the Israelites. And God hadn't chosen Samson because Samson was really great either, because, as we know, he definitely wasn't. But God decided that he wanted to use Samson to rescue his people. And the fact that he was basically an awful human being wasn't going to get in God's way. God can rescue his people using whoever he chooses. It was God's goodness and kindness and bigness that mattered. So it wasn't a problem that Samson didn't have any goodness or kindness or bigness of his own. It just made it more obvious how good and kind and big God really is. And that's very, in case you were wondering. So good and kind and big that we can't even get our heads around it with our puny little minds. I know I can't anyway. Now, you may have noticed something as we've been thinking about all the rescuers God used to rescue his people. None of them were very good at it. Well, they were okay. They all did their part. God used them to rescue his people in the end. But they weren't good enough for God's people to stay rescued. They kept turning away again and again, every time. The Israelites just kept forgetting about God and doing whatever they wanted every time. and it all kept getting worse. And Samson, the last of the rescuers mentioned in the book of Judges in the Bible, was the worst of the lot of them. It couldn't go on like this forever. It wasn't good enough. It was getting them nowhere. God's people needed something better. And of course, something better was coming, because this wasn't the big plan. This wasn't the big rescue. One thing was becoming clearer and clearer all the time. What God's people needed was a big rescuer, one who could sort things out once and for all. And who could that be? All together on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. I can't hear you. On the count of 3. Oh, this is pre-recorded. That's why I can't hear you. Anyway, you were probably right. It's Jesus. But this may shock you to hear, Samson was sort of like Jesus. Oh, not in most ways, of course. Jesus was perfect. He completely trusted and obeyed God. He was God. Samson wasn't any of those things, but the way Samson rescued God's people can remind us a bit of Jesus. It was like an echo of Jesus, but hundreds of years earlier, like a pre-echo. Well, so, how was Samson sort of like Jesus? Well, I'll tell you. The thing that reminds us most about Jesus is the way Samson rescued God's people. He did it by dying. Now, Samson had lost his strength and been captured by the Philistines. He was taken to their temple of their fake god, Dagon, where they boasted that Dagon had handed Samson over to them, which, of course, he hadn't, because Dagon wasn't real. But what the Philistines didn't know was that Samson's hair was growing back, and he was showing faith in God, possibly for the first time. And so his strength was coming back too. When the Philistines weren't looking, Samson pushed over the pillar that held the temple up so that the whole thing fell down, killing everyone in it, including Samson himself. And in the process, showing that Dagon wasn't a real god. God is the only real God with real power, and that was the beginning of God's people being rescued from the Philistines. But the end of Samson. Jesus also rescued God's people by dying like Samson did. But unlike Samson, Jesus didn't just rescue God's people from the Philistines, he rescued them from sin and death and Satan. Because of Jesus' rescue, people can have their relationship with God mended and live with him forever. And there are other ways that Jesus' rescue was better. It only needed to happen once. Once Jesus rescued his people, they'll always be rescued. It's for everyone who believes in him, not just the Israelites. And another thing, Jesus didn't stay dead. Once Samson had died, he stayed dead, but Jesus didn't. He came back to life again, proving that he had really beaten death and sin and Satan once and for all. Jesus' rescue really was the ultimate rescue, the one God's people had been waiting for. And that, my friend, was God's big plan to rescue the world. Ta-da! Totally worth the wait.